In the village of Oboro, there lived a family of 3, Mr. Ubong, Mrs. Ama, and their daughter Nsa. Nsa was her parents' only child, and because of this, they loved her so much and always showered her with love. Nsa loved her parents too, and she was always ready to do things that would please them and make them happy. She would help with little chores and assist her mother whenever she needed assistance. Nsa's father, Mr. Ubong, was a hunter. Each time he went on a hunt, he would return with a special catch for his daughter. Nsa was always happy whenever her father went on a hunt with his fellow hunters because she knew that he would bring meat home for her. Also, aside from welcoming her father every time he returned from a hunt, Nsa loved to join her mother in cooking her father's catch. In the evenings, while Nsa and her mother would cook the meat on a big firewood, Nsa's mother would tell Nsa different stories and fables, and Nsa always enjoyed these moments with her mother. Life continued like this for Nsa and her family for 9 years until tragedy came knocking on their heart. Nsa's mother had fallen terribly sick and she wasn't getting any better despite all the herbal treatment she received. Sadly, her sickness got so bad and beyond herbal help, and it claimed her life. The day Nsa's mother died, Nsa was sitting by her mother's bed. She had refused to go to school since the day her mother fell sick, and she was solely the one who took care of her mother and the house whenever her father went to hunt for meat. Before Nsa's mother passed away, she spoke to Nsa in a feeble voice and told Nsa to help her get a cup of water to quench her thirst. Unfortunately, by the time Nsa returned with the cup of water, her mother had passed away. Out of confusion, Nsa shouted and shook her mother's lifeless body, but it was already too late. The death of Nsa's mother shattered Nsa completely. Her mother was her only best friend, and she was completely lost on how to continue life without her mother. For months, Nsa continued to mourn her mother's death until it began to worry her father. Nsa's father, Mr. Ubong, was concerned about Nsa's health because she had lost so much weight in the past months, and she was slowly turning into a shadow of herself. Out of concern for his daughter, Mr. Ubong was forced to seek help from his late wife's best friend, Mrs. Eno. He wanted her to come and help Nsa. Mrs. Eno was a good family friend, and she was Nsa's late mother's best friend up until her death. The two women had been friends since childhood, so Nsa's father believed that if there was anyone who could help Nsa, it was Mrs. Eno. Like her late friend, Mrs. Eno was also married, except that she married earlier than her best friend and had 2 daughters who were both older than Nsa. The only thing was Mrs. Eno was a widow. Her late husband, a palm wine tapper, died from falling from a very tall palm tree while trying to tap palm wine one day. As soon as Mr. Obo went to share his concern about Nsa with Mrs. Eno, Mrs. Eno agreed to help. That same day, she followed Nsa's father to his compound and went straight to the kitchen to cook Nsa's favorite food. After cooking, Mrs. Eno took the food to Nsa's hut and succeeded in convincing Nsa to eat the food. She also stayed in the hut and talked to Nsa for hours until Nsa reluctantly finished her food. After that, Mrs. Eno helped bathe Nsa and wash Nsa's dirty clothes before returning to her compound. Already, Mrs. Eno was someone Nsa was fond of while her mother was still alive. The following day, Mrs. Eno went to Nsa's compound again to check on Nsa. She cooked again for Nsa and talked with her for hours until she could make Nsa laugh. For more than 6 months, Mrs. Eno continued to visit and look after Nsa until Nsa came out of her shell and returned to the happy and vibrant girl she used to be. Also, because she constantly visited the house, Mrs. Eno began to cook for Nsa's father too. She would wash his clothes and sometimes bring her daughters along to help fetch water from the stream and clean the compound's huts. To show his gratitude and appreciation to Mrs. Eno, Nsa's father would always buy her and her children big tubers of yam, palm oil, and dry fish, and he would give her a big chunk of meat every month. Mrs. Eno enjoyed receiving the gifts, but she really enjoyed making Nsa laugh and play whenever she was around. It wasn't long before Nsa began to wish his father could marry Mrs. Eno. She had seen that her father and Mrs. Eno had a good relationship, and Mrs. Eno treated her like her own child and also treated her father with respect. After thinking about it for weeks, Nsa shared her thoughts with her father. Even though her father had not considered remarrying, he believed that marrying someone who was already a mother figure in Nsa's life would be a great idea, so he agreed to it for Nsa. In the weeks that followed, everything happened so fast. In less than a month of Nsa telling her father that she wanted him to marry Mrs. Eno officially became Nsa's stepmother. When this happened, Nsa was so excited and she looked forward to the beautiful relationship she would have with her new stepmother, who was also her late mother's best friend. The first month after Nsa's stepmother moved into Nsa's father's compound with her daughters, everything was great, and Nsa did not think or suspect that her happy life would suddenly turn sour. But from the second month, Nsa began to see Pepe in her stepmother's hands. It all started with Mrs. Eno suddenly changing. Her nice and loving attitude towards Nsa suddenly changed to anger and bitterness, and she began to mistreat Nsa. Every morning by 5 a.m., Mrs. Eno would wake up and go to Nsa's hut with a plate of cold water, and she would pour the water on Nsa to wake her up. Once she woke Nsa by pouring water on her, she would instruct Nsa to sweep the whole compound and clean all the huts. Then she would instruct Nsa to go to the stream and fetch water until she filled all the drums in the compound. Not only that, she would give Nsa a deadline to do all the chores, and if Nsa failed to meet the time or deadline she was given, her stepmother would deliberately starve Nsa for the rest of the day. When it all started, Nsa did not understand why her stepmother suddenly changed. She even tried to talk to her stepmother about her new attitude, and while attempting to do that, she got the worst beating of her life. Her stepmom, together with her stepsisters, beat up Nsa badly that day and chased her out of her father's compound for the whole day. While Nsa would wake up very early to do her chores every morning, her stepsisters would be in their huts sleeping and snoring, and this always made Nsa feel horrible. Aside from sweeping, cleaning, and fetching water every day, Nsa would also be the one to go to the market and cook for her stepmother and sisters. Sadly, despite cooking for everyone, there were days Nsa did not get to eat the food she cooked. Most of the time, as punishment for not meeting her chore deadline, Nsa would cook for others but not get to eat. Other times, her stepsisters would intentionally eat Nsa's food portion and leave her with nothing. The worst part was that Nsa could not even tell her father what she was suffering at the hands of her stepmother and stepsisters because he was barely at home. Because he was a hunter, he would travel for days with his fellow hunters to search for animals, and whenever he returned, he would stay home shortly and then travel again. On the days that Nsa's father would be at home, Nsa's stepmother, Mrs. Eno, and her daughters would threaten Nsa not to say anything to her father, or else they would give her brutal beatings, and these threats would force Nsa to remain quiet. Another heartbreaking thing for Nsa was that whenever her father returned from hunting, he would bring meat for Nsa and her stepsisters to cook and eat. But Nsa's stepmother and stepsisters would either sell some of the meat and eat some without giving any to Nsa. And they would cook and eat everything without giving Nsa even the smallest piece. On days like that, Nsa would hide and cry in her heart and wish that her late mom was still alive. 7 years passed and Nsa continued to suffer silently. She even got used to doing all the chores alone and serving her stepmom and stepsisters. Because nothing had changed in the past years, she stopped complaining and accepted everything as her fate. Unknown to Nsa, luck was about to shine on her. She had just turned 17 and was eligible for marriage when their village town crier announced that the prince of the village was about to pick a wife from the young maidens in the village. The first day Nsa heard the news, she wasn't even interested. She had gone to fetch water from the stream that evening when she heard other girls talking about him at the stream. Since the prince was rumored to be an older man, everyone, including Nsa, was sure he would marry someone at his age group. Also, Nsa had seen the prince once, and from what she had seen, she believed he was arrogant. Later that evening, when Nsa returned to her father's compound, she was surprised to see her stepsisters fighting over the prince. The two sisters believed the prince would pick one of them as his bride and started making preparations. 2 days after Nsa heard about the prince's intention to marry a maiden in the village, Nsa woke up by 5 a.m. as usual to sweep and clean the compound. But that morning, she decided to go to the stream first so she could spend time alone there before other people showed up. As expected, when she got to the stream, there was no one there, but a few minutes after she entered the water to swim, she saw a man join her. It was the prince of the village, and she had no idea. Nsa did not know, but it was the prince's routine to go to the stream every morning before people showed up. He had been visiting the stream since he was a child, but as he grew famous in the kingdom, he realized that he couldn't spend time alone at the stream anymore, except if he went there very early in the morning. That morning, Nsa chatted with the prince like she was chatting with a long-time friend, despite being a stranger. The sun had not risen yet, so she could not see his face. The two of them talked about random things, and they talked about the burdens they were carrying on their shoulders without specifying what exactly they were. Before she left the stream that morning, Nsa described where she lived to the prince, but he forgot to ask her name. About a week after Nsa had met the prince at the stream, the day all the maidens had been expecting came, and the prince was set to pick a wife. As culture demanded, all the maidens were to leave their homes and go to the palace to perform a dance for the prince. Even though Nsa was much younger than her stepsisters and didn't think the prince would pick her, she told her stepmother that she would attend the dance, but her stepmother warned her not to. To ensure that Nsa would not have the time to attend the dance, her stepmother assigned her many difficult chores. She did that so Nsa would not have the opportunity to attend the dance. It wasn't that Nsa's stepmother expected the prince to choose her if she attended the dance. She actually wanted one of her biological daughters to marry the prince, so she didn't want to take any chances. One of Nsa's chores was to go and fetch water at the stream that afternoon, and from the stream, she could hear the sounds of drums playing from the king's palace. Nsa was a bit sad she couldn't attend the dance, but didn't allow it to weigh her down. After filling her pot at the stream, she went straight home, and to her greatest surprise, when she entered her father's compound, she saw the prince, the royal guards, and her stepmother and stepsisters waiting in the compound. What Nsa did not know was that, right from the morning at the stream, the prince could not stop thinking about Nsa and her soothing voice. He even went there other mornings with the hopes of finding Nsa and asking her name, but Nsa never showed up. That day at the palace, the prince asked each of the maidens who came to dance to talk to him, but none of them sounded like Nsa. So when he couldn't find the maiden he spoke with that morning, he asked his royal guards to take him to Nsa's house based on the description Nsa had shared. Before Nsa arrived, Nsa's stepmother had been trying so hard to convince the prince that the lady he spoke to at the stream was her first daughter. But the prince was adamant that she wasn't the one. As soon as Nsa stepped into her father's compound, her stepmother told the prince that Nsa was just a maid and tried to send Nsa out of the compound. But the prince stopped Nsa's stepmother and ordered Nsa to drop her water pot. Without wasting time, the prince walked to Nsa and asked her name. The second Nsa responded, the prince smiled and announced to his royal guards that she was the one he had been looking for. Nsa's stepmother and stepsisters were shocked and confused, and for the first time in a long time, they tried to act kind and friendly with Nsa, but the prince already knew what was happening. 3 days after that, Nsa and the prince wedded, and Nsa moved out of her father's compound to live with the prince in the king's palace. On the day she left her father's compound, Nsa cried so hard and prayed for her late mother's spirit to go with her. At the palace, the prince treated Nsa with love and treated her like a queen, and they lived happily ever after.